I'm Greg Messenger, and I'm a trade law and policy specialist. I'm going to be talking a bit about how the UK approaches trade policy from the perspective of government and how the government machinery kind of engages with trade policy. Now, you'll probably be aware there is a Department for Business and Trade, DBT, and as you can imagine, DBT leads on trade policy. So the Department of Business and Trade leads on trade policy in most instances. So that's relatively straightforward, but there are some challenges because actually there are lots of different departments in government that play a really important role. So DBT is one, and it's probably the most important one, and we'll talk a bit more about DBT in a moment. But there are others too. For example, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the FCDO, leads on a number of areas of policy which relate to developing countries. So our North-South relationships and agreements that sit there. And also, frankly, because of a peculiarity of the way it was agreed, the EU-UK agreement, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, our EU-UK Free Trade Agreement, that one is also run from the Foreign Office. So, as you can imagine, there has to be quite a lot of coordination and cooperation between DBT and the Foreign Office on those fronts. There are other government departments that are important because they speak to stakeholders which have a really key interest and are responsible for really key policy areas that trade policy touches on. So a concrete example for that would be agriculture and farmers and the environment. So the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, is a key stakeholder whenever there are cross-Whitehall discussions around trade policy, right? So DEFRA is often involved because agriculture is a big issue in trade policy. They lead on agri, but nonetheless, DBT leads on trade policy or FCDO or developing country policy. So there you have a question of sort of coordination and so on. There's also other ones where there might be unexpected overlaps. So the Department of Health and Social Care, DHSC, if we were to introduce new public health regulation on, say, e-cigarettes and vaping and warning labels on packets or something like that, that has a knock-on effect for trade policy because traders are affected by those additional packaging requirements. And so that has to relate to DBT in that sense. So you'll have some departments that come on a specific issue by issue basis. And then some departments have a more sort of instrumental role to play. So for example, at the border, when we charge tariffs, so that is essentially a tax on a product that crosses a border, tariff policy is run by Department of Business and Trade, our multilateral tariff policy. But it's the Treasury that is responsible for actually enacting the secondary legislation, so the law that we need to make those tariffs a real thing and actually applicable. And then HMRC, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, that does the operational bit at the border to make sure those tariffs are effectively collected and so on, and all the paperwork and systems that are involved. So yes, DBT run things, but at the same time, there are a lot of cross-Whitehall interests. There aren't just cross-Whitehall interests. There are also what we might consider vertical interests, so devolved governments. So it's not just the UK government, but also the governments of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales that are interested in trade policy and have a real task and responsibility there. Some issues, which are devolved powers that devolved governments exercise, are directly related to trade policy issues. So an example of that would be forestry management. Another one would be support payments to farmers. Those are all areas which can have a really important overlap with questions in trade and in our free trade agreements, our commitments to the World Trade Organization, our day-to-day interactions with international partners and businesses. And those actually really come from devolved governments. And it's not just where they have powers, but also some sectors will be more important to devolved governments than others. So as you can imagine, given the importance of the steel sector in Wales, it's especially sensitive for the Welsh government. Alcoholic food and beverages in Scotland is extremely important. Scotch Whisky Association, for example. But there also you'll have economic interests that are more weighty and more sensitive for those devolved governments. Now, how do they actually all engage with each other? Well, that's a bit of a different story. So when it comes to cross-Whitehall cooperation or coordination, as you can imagine, there may well be disagreement. And indeed, there are meant to be, we might say, because each government department has a different set of interests and a different priority set of stakeholders. So DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, speaks to farmers a lot more, right? An environmental group. Meanwhile, the Foreign Office speaks to foreign government, diplomat, and security services a lot more, while the BT will be principally engaged with businesses that are exporting or importing, traders, and economic interest, and groups like that. The purpose of developing cross-functional coordination is that there are formal and informal meetings, and it gets more formal the more senior it goes. But basically ways of cooperating so that you all get in a room and actually talk through these issues to identify where there are problems, where there are gaps, and so on. So that's quite an important way of doing it. And eventually agreement has to be found, right? So you'll have to get to a point where things will then get escalated and there has to be agreement between departments. That'll eventually happen at a ministerial level, and maybe in cabinet. And of course, the one sort of political element that we haven't talked about so far, which is the ultimate arbiter of this, is number 10, and the Prime Minister, who may well be essentially have to basically pick a side in the end if it gets to that stage. And that's Cabinet Office, which is effectively number 10's department, plays an important role in that regard, and coordinating, but also giving that instruction. But on a day-to-day basis, how does this work? Well, what is the UK's trade policy? How do we know what it is? Well, we're going into an election period now, so manifesto commitments are an important one. But also, government will explore and develop policies throughout the life of a government as well. And they'll do that by opening consultations, public consultations, and they'll say, we want your views on certain points. Things will get debated. They might be subject to questions in Parliament. And for example, should we have a new trade agreement? Well, there'll be consultations on that. Views from businesses and civil society, the government will respond to those things and then put forward its policies, and then there'll be debates and so on and discussions as those progress. There is a lot of discussion around transparency and how open governments should be and can be on some of these issues. If we're talking about policy development, relatively open, though of course there's always the criticism, which is consultations are really a formality and government are doing what they want to do anyway. When it comes to free trade agreements, there's a lot of criticism that we don't know what's in them while they're being negotiated. There are challenges to how open you can be. Some information is commercially sensitive. For example, what are we considering to open up one sector over another and so on? Those things are you've got to keep close to your chest and very confidential. But there are other areas where governments are likely being overly cautious because they don't want too much of a pushback until everything is agreed. So there are real tensions between you do need a certain amount of confidentiality in negotiations and being able to keep options available to you, but at the same time, you can't keep everything away from the public or at least Parliament in any event in a lot of this process. So there are concerns around that. In the end, we have key actors involved. So DBT, as we've seen, the sort of the principal actor there, but also never forgetting that, yes, FCDO for development and EU relations, but then also other key actors on subject-specific issues. So DEFRA for agriculture, Treasury for implementation and taxation, which also overlaps with trade policy, and many more beside, whether it's on net zero policy, communications and media, or public health.